welcome everyone to the ScienceHolic December webinar. My name is Scarlett. I'm the Communications Director of ScienceHolic, and as usual, I will be the host of the webinar. Joyce, would you like to give an introduction of yourself?
Hi, I'm Joyce. I'm the co-founder of ScienceHolic, as well as Molly. Because she has some other commitments, she cannot attend today's webinar.
We are very honored to have invited Dr. Joachim Krueger to be our guest today. Thank you so much for sparing an hour of your time to talk to us. Before we move on to the Q&A section, Dr. Krueger, would you like to give an introduction of yourself to our attendees?
Sure. So my name, you may be wondering, and my experience is it's very difficult for native speakers of English to pronounce. My first name, it's Hebrew, it's the German version of a Hebrew name. So when I grew up, it was pronounced Joachim, and Americans or native speakers of English don't really hear what I'm trying to say. So often I go by Joe, just for simplicity. And I was born and raised in Germany, went to university there, high school, and then a university. And I got what it's an equivalent of a master's degree in psychology there. And then I came to the United States and I went to graduate school at the University of Oregon in the 1980s. And I got my PhD there, and I was repatriated, so to speak, partly because it was a requirement of the Fulbright Commission to prevent brain drain. So after using the scholarship, I had to go back to my home country for at least 2 years before being a free agent again. And I was lucky to get a postdoc appointment in Berlin for 3 years, which was a different kind of psychology. It was lifespan developmental psychology, which opened new windows of thinking for me. But I also realized what I really wanted to do was social cognition work. And then I came to the United States, partly because, well, I was lucky to get a job offer and I took it here at Brown University. And because I liked the American system compared with the German system, as here in the United States, junior professors, assistant professors are responsible for their own research agenda. They don't work for everybody, for anybody. They have to develop a research program and do it. And if they fail, that's too bad. If they succeed, that's fine. It's a very risky proposition, but that's what I wanted. And that's what I came here. In Germany, I was in my 30s and I would have had to work under an older professor. And that would have been too delayed in my thinking that being able to do follow my own research ideas in my 40s, I wanted to do that in my 30s. So I came to Brown University in 1991. And as a social psychologist, and they wanted somebody who could teach stereotyping, prejudice, intergroup relations, that kind of thing. And that's what I had done in graduate school. And social cognition more broadly, which includes other issues like self-perception, self-esteem, self-construction, memory, social memory, decision-making, things of that nature, but not happiness at that time. So I know one question on the table is how did I get into happiness? And what you see on one of the slides is a book cover, but it's not really a book. It's a fake book. You can self-publish on Kindle. So I have not written a book on happiness. What I did do, I wrote essays on a blog that I keep at Psychology Today, because I've taught a course on happiness together with a philosopher, which was also has been an interesting education for me, because I discovered just how different the modes of thinking and doing stuff could be between disciplines. I think undergraduate students today understand that better than the professors. The professors sit in their silos and their disciplines, and undergraduates can take a class in the humanities and econ and orgochemistry, what have you, and they see this every day, and we professors lose sight of it. So I reconnected with this truth that different disciplines think very differently, and it's been a challenge. And many of my essays on happiness were born out of the need to understand after the lectures, what in the world happened here? What went on? What am I being told by the philosophers? How do I respond as a psychologist? So the essays accumulated, and at some point I realized I have critical mass. Now, what do I do? Should I look for an editor and rewrite the whole thing and make a book? And it seemed too much of an effort. And then I discovered I could just bundle them. I write a preface, and boom, there it is as a Kindle book. And so that's what that is. So it's kind of a book. The research prize is listed here. That's the finest recognition that I've received. It's a German foundation in the name of Alexander von Humboldt, who was a 19th century Renaissance man of sorts. He did everything. He was interested in everything. He did climatology, geography, mineralogy, what have you. And he was world famous at the time. And there's a foundation now, and they give out awards, and I got that, and it paid for a sabbatical semester that I spent in 2008 in Germany, in the old country. It says I'm on editorial boards of a couple of journals. That's what academics do. That's part of what we do, have to do. It's kind of a service to review papers that our colleagues submit for publication, and to serve an editorial board is also a bit of an honor if it's a good journal. So I've done a little bit of that. And the last point that you see on the slide is about my core research interests. And well, inductive reasoning is one of the basic forms of reasoning that we have as human animals. We learn, we have experiences, we generalize from the experiences, we build up knowledge, concepts that are connected to what we see and what we experience, and that's induction, most broadly defined, as opposed to deduction, where you have premises, axioms, and you do derivations, and it's logic, basically. But induction is the more uncertain lived experience and how that leads to mental models and mental representations of the world that we live in. And by a very crude differentiation, you could say, well, there is a non-social world. It's my home, my furniture, the furnace that I have to fix, maybe even the dog. But that gets a little funny there because we anthropomorphize dogs often. And then we have the social world. That's other people. And other people are much more difficult in many ways because we think about them and they think about us, and we know that they think about us, and they know that we know that they, you see where this is going. So social perception has a lot of this looping autoregressiveness built in that makes it both fascinating and difficult. And that's something I'd like to understand better. And I've been doing this for 30 years and more, and I'm still having fun.
All right, thank you so much. Before we actually start, I'm going to give a brief introduction of what ScienceHolic does as an organization. So we are a youth-run nonprofit that aims to introduce intricate scientific topics in a manner that is fun and comprehensive to teens. Our main priority is to serve as a free resource for students to learn more about scientific topics, and we strive for our teenage readers and contributors to be critical thinkers and promote thought-provoking conversations. We provide various opportunities for students around the world with English as their second language to expand their English ability, and we also provide volunteer and leadership opportunities to those who want to help others. Final notes before we start: to the attendees, if you have any questions during the webinar or later in the live Q&A session, please send them in the chat. We will try our best to go over them at the end of our webinar if they haven't already been answered. Now, let's start. Our first category of questions is with regards to Dr. Krueger's profession as a psychology professor. So Dr. Krueger, what first sparked your interest in psychology?
It's a slightly embarrassing memory because it was a bit like what your generation, I have children in your generation, what you call random. So it's not statistical randomness, but it's just weird, odd, who would have thought, as opposed to carefully reflected and deliberated and planned. And when I was in high school, there were no psychology classes, nor did I or my friends really know about psychology as a science, that it was a thing. And then I realized that some of the topics that came up were questions about human behavior and experience and thinking and reasoning. And my memory says that most of these interesting questions came up in my English course. So for me, I fit right in here because English is my second language. So I was taking 4 hours of English per week, and we would read texts, and many of those were selected. And I'll thank the teacher. Thinking back to this, the issues were actually reasoning, how people make inferences. And I remember that it captures my interest. I got into that. And I remember that my teacher once said, and it was a compliment, but it felt odd to me, but she pointed to me and she said, "You are the logician in the class." Oh, I thought, but it felt like a compliment. And I think she was onto something, because in a way that's still today how I look at questions of reasoning and inference, in terms of how is it coherent, the way that people think. Are there contradictions? That's often the first thing that I look for. So that's been a theme, and it emerged in high school. And then I stumbled into the studies of psychology, again, quasi-randomly, because all I knew was I wanted to go to university, and I had no idea what subject I should study, and I was going by exclusion. I had reasons not to study medicine, too much blood. I had reasons not to study econ, too much math, and on and on and on. And then a friend of mine had discovered some brochures. That was before the web, so we had brochures where psychology curricula were described, and he had already decided he was going to go into law school. But he thought, if I didn't go into law, I think I would study psychology, he said. Because look what they do. They look at the brain. They look at criminal behavior. They look at physiology. They look at learning, memory. And that was the moment for me when the penny dropped, and I thought, hey, that is interesting, and it's wide open. And at least at the time, it was a young science. So maybe there is still some opportunity to make a contribution, because it's not the case. It wasn't the case that everything had been studied. So there was the sense that I got, and so then I just went for it.
All right, that's a very interesting story. A lot of us, I think, as high school students, we think we have to already niche down as to what we want to pursue in life. So it's refreshing to hear sometimes about how successful people might have not found their passion until later on.
I have to be careful, because I don't want to make it sound like this is what I recommend. It may not have been the best strategy. If I judge it in hindsight, in a way I got lucky. That worked out for me. But if I were to give advice now to you, high school students, my children, of course, I would recommend more research. And now you have the internet, and you have all this at your fingertips. And I think it would be, for your generation, irresponsible not to look into what are your interests and what can you find out before you make such a decision what to study that will affect your life. I kind of stumbled into it, but it's probably not the way to go in this day and age.
Don't worry, we have questions about your advice to high school students about their future career paths later on. But to move on to the second question, as you mentioned, when you were younger, you weren't really exposed to psychology as a topic, which is a field that encompasses a lot of different areas and topics. How would you explain the term psychology to somebody who doesn't really know what this field includes?
Yeah, it's a kind of a mystical term, and the word is kind of old and is Greek, and it goes back to the Greek word for soul, which is psyche. And now we say, well, this is metaphysical or theological, but it's not scientific, but the word stuck. And so now we, working psychologists, have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by that? What is the demarcation of what's in the field of study and what's out? And I go with a definition that I heard from a mentor and friend of mine many years ago in Germany, and he probably got it from somebody else. And he said, psychology is the study of human behavior and experience. Behavior and experience. And I think that is very important because it points to the duality of what you can see, sort of objectively quantify, measure. That's behavior, something that can be recorded from a third person perspective or second person. And then there's experience, and experience at the end of the day becomes very subjective. And that's where you get a lot of hand-wringing, oh, isn't it all subjective? As if that meant it cannot be studied. But the definition tells us these are the two things, behavior and experience. There's the objective and the subjective, and all of it we should try to learn about. And if you say, oh, this is subjective, the way you feel right now is just subjective, so nobody else would ever know, we still have indirect access. So for one, you can tell me, how do you feel? Oh, I'm kind of sad right now. Oh, I'm agitated. And these are not random words. They do refer to inner states. So then these verbal reports, which are not nothing, which are not the same thing as the inner experience, but they are a proxy, they can then be studied statistically, quantitatively, objectively, and that's as much of what we do actually.
All right. Then what is one specific experience throughout your research or teaching career that you find particularly rewarding or memorable? What is the first memory that you think of, in other words, when you ask this question?
An experience throughout your research or teaching. So that seems to refer to something that happens again, not a unique thing that happened once, boom, but a type of experience that happens again and again. So in research, I would say it's the moment that it becomes clear to me that I have an idea that I find exciting, interesting, theoretically meaningful, and tractable in scientific terms. When I have that experience, it gives me great joy. It's elevating. It's a kind of a high. It may be a few seconds, it may be a few days, but it's really very cool. When an idea comes up where I think, I can work with this, I can work this out, I can translate this into a question, and into a question that is tractable, that we can design an experiment and find an answer to. And a lot of people have asked, again and again, this is a question of psychological research, where do these ideas come from? How does that happen? What's the nature of the creative process? That itself is actually a question in psychology. And in my experience, and what I've learned, it was already said by Bertrand Russell in 1930, who wrote a book about happiness. And he talked about this creative process. And he wrote that you have to think as hard as you can, maybe for days or weeks or months until it hurts. And you give up and you just let it sit. And then time passes and then it comes to you. Maybe not always, but often. So much of our cognitive work is going on underground. That is, it's just simply not accessible to introspection or self-awareness, but it's going on anyway. But it's in a code that's not verbal or conscious. But then it can punch through, and then you have this aha moment. But these aha moments are not random. They have to be prepared. So if you never do your homework, if you don't read the literature, if you don't do the hard work of thinking, even if you have to give up for a while, then you won't have these ideas. So you have to prime that pump, you have to prepare the mind, you have to do the hard work, but then you may get these rewards of having these ideas. And that happened to me a number of times, beginning in graduate school and then since. And when it comes, it's such a liberating release, because it's a reward for the pain of the hard thinking that we had to go through. And it also tells you, because you've done your homework and you've developed the skills on how to do research, now you know what you have to do. And this is a wonderful feeling. It's the duality of this feeling. Now I have the idea, it has arrived, and I know what I have to do to turn this into something solid that can be communicated, studied, and maybe published. So that's the thing in research. And in teaching, that very thing that I've just described is the hardest thing to teach. And some individuals are not ready for it. They don't know what I'm talking about when I describe this, and they don't want to do it. They just say, oh, professor, give me a project, I'll execute it. And that makes me sad, because what I want students to have is this kind of experience. But they have to go, they have to acquire the skills, and they have to think, and they have to live through the disappointments, and then it's going to come to them. And when I see that in a student whom I've coached or trained or taught, then it's just wonderful. So that's the other kind of joy that I find, because you asked about the rewarding experiences. So those are the two.
It does sound really, it is rewarding to know that your hard work has paid off, not only for yourself, but for the people you teach. I think this is the last question in this section. So is this career path you've taken what you've envisioned yourself being in during your teenage years? Was it when you had the moments when you realized that, oh, psychology is what I want to do, but is this something similar to what you've wanted to become when you were younger?
Yeah, it gets a little more complicated and a little more personal here.
If you're not comfortable with sharing, we understand.
Sorry?
If you not comfortable with sharing,
No, I know. I'm responsible for what I'm able to say, what I'm willing to say, that I say, and that's on me. I understand. But so I'll try. And I want to be as frank as I can be. But again, remember, what you're getting from me is a sample of one, and other academics have different pathways, and you already know that from other webinars. But anyway, in my case, basically, I've found it very difficult to think ahead more than 2 years or so. So my working time horizon of what I would plan and what I'm going to accomplish is good for 2 years. And then, the years added up, and I've had a good run. But it's not the case that at age 30, I had mapped out in my mind what I would want to do over the next 30 years until I'm 60. So I had a limited time horizon. I do believe this is fairly typical, probably. But my concrete professional goals were somewhat different, because I had this idea in my head. I wanted to contribute to the real economy. That was very important, and that meant to me, because I wanted to do psychology, maybe I can be an organizational psychologist, industrial psychologist, consultant to management, that kind of thing, which is now very popular. A lot of my students want to go into that. In my time, it was a fringe, very small field. Most students wanted to go into clinical or consulting psychology. And I thought I needed to do that so that the whole effort was justified. It was very difficult for me to see that basic research by itself has intrinsic utility. I found that very hard to accept, and I had people who argued against that. So this goal stayed with me for a long time until I just gave up and said, God put me on the planet, so I do basic psychological research. This is what I'm here for. This is what I love. This is what I'm doing. And because I waited long enough, I came full circle in a way, because for the last decade I had some involvement in executive training, executive leadership courses, master's programs. So in the end, I got to do some of the things that I had thought were my mission professionally, but then they weren't, but I got around to them anyway. But, the career life, the life course of the career, to me, I view it as an ongoing process of self-discovery, where every year, with every passing year, you find out a bit more about who you are and what you're here for to do.
Thank you very much for your answers.
Not all planned out.
As you all know, Dr. Krueger has kind of written his own book and has helped edit a couple other books. Looking at the time, we have around 30 minutes left, so I will give a brief introduction of each of the books he has helped contributed to, and perhaps we will just cover 1 or 2 questions regarding the books, because I want to save some time for the attendee questions. So The Quest for Happiness in 31 Essays, of which Dr. Krueger has briefly mentioned earlier in his introduction, explores questions about the nature of happiness and techniques to gain and sustain it. He has edited around 3 other books, one of which is The Self in Social Judgment, Studies in Self and Identity, of which it provides historical overview of the self in social judgment and elaborates on major themes regarding this topic. Rationality and Social Responsibility, Essays in Honor of Robin Mason Dawes, reflects his wide-ranging impact on psychological theory and empirical practice, and also developed themes of rationality and social responsibility. And lastly, Social Judgment and Decision-Making, Frontiers of Social Psychology, brings together classic key concepts and innovative theoretical ideas in the psychology of judgment and decision-making in social contexts. This is the broader question, but what inspired you to write The Quests of Happiness in 31 Essays, or just basically find the time to write 31 essays and combine them into a Kindle book?
Yeah, I think I answered half of this question already, because this is blog post that I wrote, some of which I wrote as part of the experience of teaching the philosophy and psychology of happiness with my colleague who is a philosopher. And so one of the themes that I discovered that the philosophers care very much about, which is a skepticism with regard to hedonism. So hedonism means that what the animal and the human animal wants is more pleasure and less pain. And that to me just sounded as true as anything can be in this world. Why would you not want to have more pleasure and less pain? Really? So I thought hedonism has to be true, and I was taken aback with the philosophers arguing, oh, you think you're happy and you think you're having fun, but you don't really know what's going on. So some of the essays are my response, trying to work out what is meant by hedonism and how I feel about these questions. Other essays are beyond this question of hedonism, and I realize a lot of things in our culture are missing in my course that we teach. So there are other ways to look at life. One is you can look at life as something that's tragic, like the ancient Greeks did, and happiness was not really their concern. The Greeks also talked a lot about intoxication and enthusiasm and drunkenness. They had a god for it, Dionysus. And I think in this culture, in the North American culture, that's something that's viewed with a lot of suspicion. And that the preferred view of happiness is something more calm and sedate. And so these are questions with which I struggled. So one, if you take a peek at that book, you'll find that the meanings of happiness are quite diverse. And that's just how it is, I think. I don't think there will be a time, and the philosophers have been arguing for centuries now, they will not find agreement. So we just have to live with a multiplicity of conceptions of what happiness is. And one thing that's very popular in my field in psychology is, can we find interventions like we do in clinical psychology and counseling? We want to reduce suffering. That's been studied for a long time. Reduce human emotional suffering. Can we also increase mood and happiness in a sustained way? And if so, what do we do? And obviously people want to know. And the answer is, there is no golden key to the kingdom there, that you just turn this switch and you're going to be happy. You might think there is, and you're probably going to go into drugs and you'll pay the price later, and that's not a good idea. But there are a number of tweaks that, and what's interesting is that people underappreciate them, or they get them wrong. So for an example, what I tell my students, if I have one thing to tell my students, I have one sentence to give them to send them off and to be happier, I tell them, take a walk in nature with somebody you love, or at least like. If you do that, you get 3 points for one, because walking is good. Our bodies have evolved to be mobile. Our bodies are not constructed to sit. A moving body is a happy body, and there's a lot of physiology that we understand fairly well, all the way to endogenous endorphins. So walking is good. Nature is good. It's called biophilia. So if you put people in a natural environment, the woods, the beach, plants, maybe animals, people will be happier. They light up, and you can see it neuroscientifically, as opposed to if you put people, it's a punishment. You put them in prison, you see walls, concrete, stones, people are less happier in a man-made environment, in particular if it's too geometrical. So nature is good, exposure to nature is good. And then the third, who is the other person? One or more other people, somebody you love or like. That's social connection, which of all the elements in happiness is probably the most important, because we are, by the graces of our evolution, we're not designed to live alone. Some animals are. Orangutans, for example, can do very well. They want to be alone. They come together to mate, then they separate again. Most other primates live in groups, and chimpanzees, gorillas, and human beings are like that as well. This is one of the things that makes the COVID era so difficult. I'm happy to have tech. I'm happy to have this Zoom. It helps. I don't know what it would be like without it, but it's not the same as real human contact. It's 2-dimensional, and we want it to be 3-dimensional or more.
All right, thank you very much. I think we should address this question, but as you've edited a couple other books, and this was a question from one of our attendees who was curious about this topic, how did you discover the opportunities to edit these books?
Randomness. Let's go back to randomness. So the first one, the self and social judgment, credit goes to, can you see this? There are 3 editors, Mark Alec, am I the second one? And then Dunning. What's the order? Alec, Krueger, and Dunning. Alec, Dunning, and Krueger. Mark Alec just passed away. He was a friend, and it was his idea. He had worked on self-enhancement, or the illusion of superiority, for years, dedicated his career to it. David Dunning was interested in that. I was interested in social projection, how people come to think that others are similar to themselves. And so we came to a point of critical mass. There's a lot of literature. We're very excited about it. And it was Alec who said, hey, let's invite our friends, other people that we know do the best work in that area, and let's put a book together. And we did. It was 2004, I think. The other book, this is the type of book that has a German name in the United States. It's called a Festschrift. And a Festschrift, it's a fest like festival. Schrift is to give somebody, to give something short shrift is writing. And so a Festschrift is a book with essays in honor of a person who's either retired or retiring or recently deceased. Usually you hope you do it in their lifetime. And for me, there was Robin Dawes, who was one of my mentors in graduate school and somebody who I greatly admired, from whom I learned a lot about rationality and game theory, social dilemmas, and how to study these things with an eye to, are we actually contributing something to human well-being, as opposed to just science for its own sake. And he was a giant in psychology. And so when he became older, I thought the time had come. It was 2005, and I organized a conference, and I invited his friends and former students, and we had a day-long symposium. And then I asked this symposiast to write a chapter. We put a book together, and it was published by the American, it was what used to be called the American Psychological Society, which is now the Association for Psychological Science. And there it was. It's a lovely book. It's a statistical fact that Festschrifts do very poorly, and they sell very poorly. That's just how it is. So it's a bit of a labor of love, and of all these things. I'm happy. I'm so proud of the title that I found for it. Rationality and social responsibility, because that encapsulated for me what Robin Dawes stood for. He was a champion of rational thinking, coherent thought, freedom of contradiction, sanity, as it were, and yet it should be good for something, for the group, for other people, for society. And the third was again an edited volume that I edited myself, and I brought together authors whose work I knew, and I knew it would fit. And this was in 2012, and I'm kind of proud of this book because it's a theme. It's the theme of all the things that I cared about in social cognition and psychological science. And then it's nice to have it bound, so to speak, the best ideas of that time. So that's that.
All right, thank you very much. Let's move on to another section, which is what we usually call miscellaneous section. These will cover your advice for our students and different things that don't really fit in the other categories. What does your typical workday look like as a researcher and as a university professor?
over the last 8 months or before? Yeah. It's a little bit of a difference. So some things stay the same. So basically, what you have to do as a university professor, there are 3 categories of work where you have to make a contribution and you have to show at the end of the year that you did. One is research, the other is teaching, and the third is service. So that means you sit on committees, you contribute to the administration of the department, which is more of a drag than the other 2. So, but it has to be done. And on any given day, you would do some of maybe all of the 3. And research, it spans so much from just sitting and thinking deeply and hoping to have that idea coming up, reading broadly, taking notes, writing a manuscript, revising a manuscript, training students, actually getting the data in an experiment, getting the experiment to be approved, to be run, analyzing the data, and on and on and on. One time I actually sat down and I asked myself, what are the things that we do as professors? And I wrote a blog post. And I was amazed at how long the list was of discriminable activities that we have to do to complete the job. It's amazing. So teaching takes roughly 2 forms. One is the classroom, or now Zoom, where you face a group. It could be a seminar, it would be 20 students, maybe it could be a lecture, you have 200 people that you talk to. Sometimes there are teaching assistants who are intermediaries between the professor and the students. Then they have to be trained, they have to be evaluated. And then there's the teaching of one-on-one, where the professor interacts directly with individual students. And that's the best. I think that's the most intense. And it's not only graduate students, some undergrads take it upon themselves to join a lab or to make contact with professors. And that can be very rewarding for the students, because they learn things that they don't learn in the classroom. They get to look behind the curtain and see how the sausage is made. Where is all this coming from? So I've always encouraged students and my own children, when they go to college, see if you find mentors, and to have some, besides the classwork, some work that's individualized with researchers who are doing whatever they're doing. And it may not be even the kind of research that you want to do for the rest of your life, but see if you can get some introduction to what that looks like. Where do the questions come from? I think Dr. Firestein brought that up as well. He talked about ignorance and finding questions that are worth asking, as opposed to all the facts that are on the textbook and then nobody cares about it anymore. The professors don't. It's like yesterday's news. What they spend the day on is asking, what are we going to do next? What are, of the infinite number of possible questions, what are the ones that we must ask? And do we know enough to actually frame these questions in a way that we can go after them and invest in research? And that happens kind of chaotically from the moment you wake up until the moment you close your eyes. There are also cultural differences. So I grew up in Germany, and the Germans have a stricter separation of the professional time and the private time. So they may, at 5 o'clock, they go home and it's like a switch, and they go into a different mode. And in the United States, it's not that clear. For better or for worse, and I find myself often taking these questions home, and I think about them as I walk the dog, as I take a shower. It's something as, you know, the running. And on a good day, it yields results. On a bad day, I may want to just disconnect and just set that aside and have not think about research or anything like that. That can happen, but it's a bit more random and chaotic in how that happens.
All right, because we're a little tight on time, I think we're going to move on to attendees' questions because I do want their questions to be addressed. But though if we have other time, we can go back to some of the more questions. But to attendees, if you have any questions right now, please feel free to leave them in the chat. But these questions we're addressing will be from our registration forms. So would you mind quickly explaining what do you think is the most important for students? Clinical practice, social study, or research?
I haven't the foggiest idea. That depends on who you are and what you want to study. I'm sorry, this is plainly a question of personal preference. There are those who want clinical practice and they want to, that's where they want to go, or social study or research. And we hope to have people interested in each of these categories, but everyone has to know for themselves of what they prioritize. Having said that, I've always encouraged those who do want to go into clinical psychology, let's say, and practice, get some exposure to research, if it's for a year or two, so you know how that works, which will then enable you to read and understand research literature, because you know how it's done, so you understand it better, and then you can translate it into your professional needs in clinical practice or social study.
All right. Another attendee says that he or she doesn't really have a very clear career path right now. So what can they do to start a clinical psychology career, and how can they prepare for graduate school?
Where is this person at? In college or in high school?
I believe she or he is in undergrad study right now.
So if the person is in undergrad, in college, in a psychology program, then I would hope that the Department of Psychology there has at least one faculty member who is qualified as a pre-clinical advisor for just those students who want to move on into graduate studies in clinical psychology, to give them advice where to look and how to go about it. That's the person to see.
All right. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this question, but should bracket international students start working after college or continue their graduate studies, and how should they choose between the two? What factors should be considered when making the choice?
Very difficult. So I think there are different schools of thought. One school is to go as fast through the system as possible. So you go to college, then you go to graduate school. One step following the other, as opposed to do something in between, and if so, what? So what I've seen that seems to work fairly well, if students who stay in the system at a university and they work in a lab as research assistants or lab managers for a year or two, and then they apply for that program, they have a tremendous skill set that gives them a great advantage over more recent college graduates. That is my impression, and it's something that might work very well.
All right. I have one question that I think this is a more serious question that I think we should address first. What is the connection between psychology and mental health disorders, for example, depression, anxiety, bipolarism, and how do you think students can maintain good mental health?
Well, it's two different studies, different questions really. So the first one, and again, I'm not a clinical psychologist or psychopathologist, and the study of mental health and the disorders, depression, PTSD, anxiety, bipolarism, they are at the intersection of psychology and psychiatry and neuropsychology. And now neuroscience, psychology alone is insufficient, I think, to give us a complete picture there. How can students maintain good mental health?
If you're unable to answer the question.
This is delicate. And if mental health is not good, it can be not good in many different ways. And it can be not good as a pre-existing condition that a person brings to college or graduate school. And then you can ask, what are the proper resources one should avail oneself of? Doctors, psychiatrists, counselors. If there is one main global factor that impacts this, it's stress. Stress is created by specific things that happen in life, but they can be chronic, and then the body's response is non-specific. It's this arousal that is elevated, it stays elevated, and it will make the body sick. So heightened risk of inflammation and what have you. So then you have some behavioral techniques that students can learn, and hopefully, a good college has resources to help them to do it, to manage stress. And often simply what that means is to manage time. Because the time demands are tremendous now on today's college students, much greater than in my generation, I think. And the expectations are very, very high. There are 4 courses, and some of the courses have multiple meetings per week, and they have lab groups and sessions to go to as well, and they have exams. And 4 courses are not even enough. There has to be volunteer work, and there have to be clubs, and there has to be this and that and the other. And some students even have to have jobs, and they have to make a living, and they have to work. This is a lot. And if a student feels they're in danger of being overwhelmed by these stresses and demands, then all I can say is look locally where you are, where the person is, what are the resources available that the institution offers to help students before these things get out of hand.
All right, thank you very much for your answers. I think I'm really sorry for flying to info about the questions, but I do want to address more on your advice for high school students, because most of our attendees right now are currently in high school. So back to our miscellaneous section, what is your biggest piece of advice you would give to your high school students who would like to work in the STEM fields in the future?
That is really, that's really very broad. And so if you give me a broad question, I give you a broad answer. And as a social psychologist, I would say, see if you can surround yourself with people of similar interests, who are not overly competitive, so that you have a group, a connectivity with people who are also interested in orgo as you are, and so that you can do this together. I think social isolation, and particularly in these demanding fields, where you sit on your own and you try to work towards an exam, and all you see is the exam, or the score that you want to get is a recipe for, again, too much stress and unhappiness. Don't do it alone.
I think we have time for one more question before we can end the webinar. So what do you think of the relationship between STEM and the humanities, aka non-STEM subjects?
That's a topic I became more sensitive to lately, and I could give you a lecture, but I have a minute. What can I say? Roughly, STEM fields and the humanities, it's two different worlds on campus. They hardly talk to each other, and maybe even despise each other, and they don't know what the value is that the other creates. Again, I watched Dr. Firestein's a webinar on this site, and what he said was fascinating. And he's a biologist and a neuroscientist, and he said, as a college student, if everybody says, oh, critical thinking, that's sort of the main thing that you have to learn, and then you go to orgochemistry and you have to rehearse. And he said, critical thinking, if you want that, and you should take a couple of courses in the humanities, because they argue, that's what they do, and that will sharpen your blade, your mental blade, and will challenge you to think critically. So I see the wisdom in that. And I try to, for myself, I try to read literature and history, and I see the different kinds of modes of thinking. And lately I've begun to wonder and write about how experimental psychology can be used to make sense of historical events or people who lived in the past, where all we have is written records. And if psychology has discovered anything, then there should be some kind of translation that's possible between the science as we do it in the lab and the text that we see about humans who lived, on even fictional characters, where we find some kind of mapping between psychological science and the humanities material. And I think that's a lot of fun, and it can be done. Not perfectly, but it's not nothing.
All right, thank you very much. With time constraints, I'm afraid we have to end the webinar here. I'm very sorry if we weren't able to cover some of your questions, but for more of Dr. Krueger's thoughts on psychology, he mentioned about how some of his essays in his Quest of Happiness in 31 Essays are on here, and how he also included a professor's responsibility here. You can find them on his blog on Psychology Today. Here's the link is below here, or you can just search up his name along with Psychology Today in search engines to find it. So with this, I think we're going to conclude the webinar. Thank you very much to Dr. Krueger for sparing an hour of your time so late at night to talk to us. And we're very honored to have you here today. And to the attendees, thank you very much for attending. You can see our social media links here on the screen, and we also have a Donate to ScienceHolic page up on our website so we can dedicate more of our efforts to publishing our winter seasonal edition magazine. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Krueger. I'm quite sorry for the mess in this webinar with flying around. And to the attendees, we will send you a follow-up survey about the quality of this webinar and your suggestions for future webinars. But we hope to see you all again. Thank you very much for joining us.